inspire players, and educate them around the world. Since there are more people playing games more than ever before, it's become evident just how important it is to create games that can both educate and entertain people equally. So, how can we understand the balance between education and entertainment? And more importantly, how can we begin to comprehend just how vital gaming is as a social tool for change? This question is complex, but it's one that can help us understand how games are a powerful device for people and society. I'm Robin Mosley, and this is Open World Dialogue, sponsored by Maximum Games. And today we have three great panelists here to discuss this very subject. Up first, we have Dr. Karen Kat Schrier. Dr. Schrier is an associate professor and the director of the Games and Emerging Media program at Marist College. She currently consults as a game designer for the World Health Organization and is a co-PI on a Templeton Foundation grant on VR and empathy. Dr. Schrier is the author and editor of over 100 published works, including We the Gamers, How Games Teach Ethics and Civics, published by Oxford University Press. Up next, we have Vanessa Nyarko. Vanessa is a narrative and realization producer at the Coalition, who previously managed the animation, world life, and mission giver systems at Ubisoft Toronto for Far Cry 6, as well as cinematics for Far Cry 6 DLC. Along with her leadership roles and initiatives such as Women in Gaming, Black Kids Code, and working with schools to speak on the importance of and opportunity for young girls in gaming, Vanessa has been featured on panels with Film Gaming, the cast of Mythic Quest, and most recently spoke at GDC about building better ways to put people first in production, and PG Connect Seattle about telling better stories on a budget. Vanessa's long-term goal is to create better methods and opportunities to better impact storytelling in games, as well as increase the understanding of representation and diversification in the industry on and off the screen. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nicole Hassler. Dr. Hassler is a licensed clinical psychologist hailing from Buffalo, New York. Her training is in multiple modalities, including cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy. She received her doctoral degree from Medaille College in December of 2018. However, she's been treating patients since 2013 in various settings, such as schools, psychiatric hospitals, private practices, and state and private agencies for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Her main focus is in treating children and adolescents struggling with anxiety, depression, and trauma. She also works with adults struggling with similar disorders, as well as personality disorders. Dr. Hassler identifies herself as a full-time geek whose heart has always been claimed by all things Batman. In addition, she enjoys all things Marvel, video games, and have a penchant for building Lego. Currently, she works in private practice, incorporating gaming and all things geeky into her therapeutic practice. Go Bills. So I want to thank you all for being here tonight. I'm super excited to jump right into the questions. We have so little time and so many questions to pack in. So I want to start with the very first one, which I think is important, helps build a foundation upon the rest of this conversation, which is really understanding how would you all define gaming for social good? And what I would love for you to think about or tackle is either from a just very general standpoint or even from your own experience in your industry.
Well, for me, I would say that it's using gaming as a method to be able to educate people on important topics, things like societal issues, civic engagement, political awareness. For myself in the psychology world, I love games that incorporate mental health in them as well, to be able to, be able to play through that and understand it a little bit better, and to develop, empathy as well for others that may be struggling, even if it's just in a virtual format.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think of, games for social impact as, everything related to health and care for ourselves, for each other, for the planet, for our universe. It's like, how do we take better care of ourselves and of each other. And so that could be, like thinking really broadly about the healthcare system or making games for medical training. And it could also be really specific, like the project I'm working on right now as part of a Templeton grant with colleagues at the Lagos Business School, where we're creating a VR game to support empathy for each other, for other youth. So there's so many different ways you can think about it, but it really, like, in sum, it's about care.
Yeah, I would agree and echo both of those points. Also, it's amazing to be here with all of you lovely women. So thank you so much for the time and for being here as well. I would describe gaming for social good quite similarly as sort of an act or initiative within gaming whose core intent is to progress the state of our communities, or maybe our industry or the world towards a more positive outcome. So in the tangible sense, it could be something like, charity work that is using games or edutainment as one of their main mediums, or volunteer work similar to the work I do with Black Kids Code for Girls here in Vancouver, where we teach Black youth the digital literacy skills and the foundations that they would need if they so choose to pursue a career in game development or in tech. But this could also be games that sort of forward important conversations or bring people together on relevant issues, or just bring people to the table to discuss those relevant issues. And so I really do believe that it could be any game, even the AAA ones that explore personal identity or actively participate in learning or building those sort of social connections. I really see it as a safe space to tackle these problems in a more fail-safe environment that we could then go on to have those conversations in the real world.
Awesome. I think all of those answers are really great. And I think one of the big things, it's going to roll into the second question, but one of the big things I always think about is how long games have existed, how little most of us know about the history of games and what they have come from, whether it's education or entertainment, and then how there's this power struggle, or at least in my head, there's a power struggle of creating games that are strictly for entertainment purposes. Those exist, and then those that are for educational purposes. But then there are some that really blend together, quite honestly. Not all are the best, but some of those are out there that do a good job at informing people of different communities, identities, feelings, mental health, all of these great things. So how do you all see the definition or just the gaming industry in general changing for social good over time? And then what's the biggest difference between how we think about video games now versus what they were maybe even 30 years ago?
So I would definitely say, like, nowadays I'm seeing a lot more diversity, a lot more inclusion in video games. Just thinking about, even like a Telltale game, like things like Life is Strange, like being able to see, like, you have the main character being a female and struggling with, all different sorts of issues, trauma, mental health, all that sort of stuff, and being able to kind of put somebody in the driver's seat to be able to say, how would I respond in this situation? Or even if it's not how they would normally respond, but being able to explore, what would happen if I responded in this way. I think we've come a long way from just the two button games that didn't really give you as much choice or show even as much diversity. There is a huge shift in what the games look like today.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think we've come a long way, and games have evolved from those games whose sole purpose was to just educate or inform. Shout out to Math Circus. When I was in school, it was just a game about learning math, and that was the whole thing. But you knew what you were getting into. That was the sole purpose. But now I think it includes games that would more traditionally be considered as specifically games for entertainment, but they still have an important message to share, just like Nicole mentioned as well. And speaking from my own experience, I know personally in my childhood, in the past, these games would have been considered as things that were just like rot your mind, or like things that you didn't want, or parents at the time didn't want their kids to engage in. But now we're seeing that we have the use of these games, for example, Roblox, and we're teaching kids how to code just based on these games as well. So it's not in all aspects that a game needs to specifically be for social good. We can also utilize the games that are existing, whose focus or whose sole purpose might not be for social good, but then adapt it to social good. So we are teaching that message.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with both of you. Vanessa, I love what you said about it doesn't necessarily have to be an educational game, quote unquote, right? This idea that, There's a lot of games that you would think of as like pure entertainment. Like for me, like the Red Dead Redemption series, it's like made by the same publisher, that created, things like Grand Theft Auto, which we don't think of as like educational at all. But on the other hand, like I learned so much from Red Dead Redemption, whether it's about taking care of a community, whether it's about what it's like to be an outlaw in the Wild West, which is a moment in United States history that I really couldn't access otherwise, right? Like I'm not an outlaw, I'm kind of a rule follower, but in this game, I get to be someone who has a different morality system than I have. And it helps me to grapple with my own morality, right? It doesn't make me a bad person. It doesn't suddenly make me like decide to be a cowboy, right? But it helps me to understand what it was like to be having that tension between like what it means to be free and independent and what it means to be under the law, right? And these are tensions that still exist in America in terms of like what it means to be independent. And I would never have been able to learn that without playing this game. And, I always think about the fact that like, yeah, and I agree, like, thank goodness games have gotten more diverse and inclusive, and they've started to care about like everybody being allowed to play. But I also think like at the same time, like the graphics have gotten better, certainly, and like the games have gotten maybe more complex, but like deep down, play is human. Play is just part of us, and we have to play. And even if we weren't given like these fancy games, we'd still be like picking up sticks and like making games out of it, or like moving rocks around and like creating a game. And we're always learn, like think back to your childhood, like whether it was hopscotch or Oregon Trail or what was it, Math Circus, you were like picking things up, you were learning through play. And we can't help it, and we can't help but play, and we want to play, and we yearn to play. And so as much as things have changed, and I think people have like included more types of play and included more people in play, which is awesome, and represented more people in play, we also deep down have always wanted to play. And maybe we're just accepting it more now that we are players, that we like to play.
And I'd like to piggyback on that just a little bit, sorry, because like what you were saying, because it helps us explore our identities a little bit more as well. So I love RPGs, especially in therapy. I use a lot of The Witcher because it's one of my favorite games. And again, kind of, when you go up and you talk to somebody in the game, you have a choice to make, are you going to help this person or are you going to walk away? And in therapy, when I have a client that's playing this game and they're making this choice, I'll ask them like, well, why did you make that particular decision? Well, because I'm normally a helpful person, so I wanted to go help, or I'm always the helper and I'm tired of always, people always needing to rely on me. So I decided to, use the game as a means of being able to say no and explore that part of my identity that I wouldn't normally be able to explore in my everyday life.
That's so great. I did research on a game called Fable 3, which is a role-playing game where you play as like a prince or princess and you're trying to make decisions, ethical decisions for this world of Albion. It's this, fantastical world with like beasts and all sorts of things, quests that you get to go on. And it was really interesting because like people would bring their own personal circumstances into the game. Like, for example, like one of the people I did research with, he was trying to adopt a child. And so when he had the chance to build an orphanage, he wanted to do that. Like he wanted to be, building something that represented him. And then, but like you were talking about like identity and trying to figure out who you are, people would really, participants in my study, like they would really try hard to figure out like, who am I? And like, what kind of ethical decisions should I make? Like one of my participants would call up his dad every time he had a big decision and talk through the decisions with him. And this was a game. And then one of the big decisions in the game is whether or not you save this NPC. So it's not a player character, right? So it's not controlled by anyone. It's just a virtual character. And, do you save this character Walter or do you not? And everybody was like, I must save Walter, right? They were like, please do not hurt Walter. He's been my mentor the whole time. He's been my friend. I don't want anything bad to happen to him. And they would like go out of their way to try to save him. And it was interesting, right, to see that, you know, people really cared about these game characters and they cared about the decisions, but they didn't necessarily have to be like decisions they would make in real life, but they really did try hard to think through those decisions.
I think what's really great about that too, and what's I think core to what we're all saying, is that at the fundamental level is learning through play. When we were younger, we learned through play. We learn through play when we're older as well. Like, who am I? Like, the questions are different. The questions that we're asking are different, but we're still learning through engaging with play. And I think that's what's so powerful about gaming as a whole and gaming for social good, is that whether or not the game is specifically for social good, we're learning. We're learning every time we play. You know, it might be that we're learning something about ourselves that's, you know, it's anecdotal, but at least it's something that we've learned for ourselves. So there's varying scales of how that social impact towards the impact of that social good, but it's there. And we're learning every time that we pick up the controller, which is really cool too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love what you said, is that no matter what age you are, right? Because people always think, well, you know, games are for kids and they're the ones learning, but like, no, like adults are learning. Like, I'm still learning. Thank goodness, right? Because who wants to just be completely static, or like not like, you want to be having that dynamic relationship with yourself and with the world. And it's so beautiful that you can do that through a game.
Before I move on to the next question, just really quickly, when you all brought up old school games or the education games, the first thing that popped up in my head was Mavis Beacon to teach me how to type. And I still love typing games to this day because of that, all because of playing that in school. And then a game that I didn't finish, but that could be a whole nother topic in itself, but still taught me something, was Hades. I definitely dislike playing games where I lose things. I don't keep things. I'm a hoarder. So that's why I love RPGs. And I don't even use all of my items in those games, but that's a whole nother thing as well. But with Hades, it just taught me getting a little bit better at letting go of things and knowing that dying and coming back to life doesn't mean you lost the game. You learned something new, and so now you can put that into practice and continue to move on and do something else. So this conversation just sparked stuff that I don't necessarily think about. With that being said, what are some games you've played or that you know that come to mind with its pulse on societal change? And again, Vanessa, you brought up AAA games and how they don't necessarily have to be about education. They can be about entertainment, but they have that component of it. So with any of you, are there games that you can think of that just you feel like is a good foundation to help people understand societal change, or at least has its pulse on it?
I mean, the game that really first comes to mind for me was Animal Crossing New Horizons, right? I mean, it came out right when the pandemic was starting to ramp up, at least in the States. And I just remember every day I'd go and I'd like water my plants and I'd collect bugs, and I felt like I'm much more peaceful. But I think there's also the larger connection to other people, right? You can visit other people's islands. You can decorate your own island. By decorating your island and your home, it's expressing your identity and what matters to you. But you could also go to other islands, and other islands could be anything, right? So it could be that there's a company that like has a branded island, which there are, or it could be like PETA having their own island and doing protests against the collection of virtual bugs and fish. Right? They were actually protesting putting these virtual critters into a virtual museum. So that was pretty hilarious. And then, I mean, there's like President-elect Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, Vice President-elect at the time. They were elect because they were candidates. They had their own islands for their candidacy. And then people were also protesting like governments, like the Chinese government. So there are like protests and civic action being taken in Animal Crossing. So it's like a cute, cuddly game where you are trying to use some of these really important skills like empathy and expression, but also has this larger civic context to it. And it was just really amazing in different ways.
So I love Animal Crossing. Wow. I use it in therapy all the time. It's one of those games, kind of how you mentioned, like you water your plants, you weed your island. It's a very relaxing game, from the music to the sounds. It's what in psychology we call mindful, being able to be present in the present moment with, little distraction. So I use that a lot for clients that are struggling with a lot of anxiety, because it is just one of those games that helps you chill out and relax. And again, what I love about that game too is like the avatars. You create your own avatar, so you can be whoever you want in that, there's no limit. So I love any game where you get to kind of create your own avatar and be whoever you want and make it a representation of yourself. I also, in my practice, I use Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice. Again, we got a female in the lead role, which is awesome. It's not something that we see very often. There's always the damsel in distress that the male hero needs to protect and rescue. But she also has psychosis, and that's a struggle throughout the game. So it's a way to, for people to understand, again, that mental health aspect, but also develop that empathy for people that are experiencing that as well, something that may not be talked about on a large scale, because mental illness still has that stigma surrounding it, unfortunately. So it's nice to be able to have not only a female-centric game, but also that mental health component to it as well.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I would say Hellblade is one of my favorite games that's come out recently. So definitely on the list for me as well. I'd say maybe not one that most people think about, but Forza Horizon 5 in the last year, or maybe 2 years, added full American Sign Language and British Sign Language support for all of its in-game cinematics. And I really felt that really raised the bar and helped to start conversations of what it means for games to truly be for everyone, and for it to truly be an inclusive space for everybody who loves to game and loves to play. Another one that I played a few years back, Never Alone, made in collaboration with, I believe it was the Inupiat people, the native people of Alaska, to tell their story, and brought over 50 or more collaborators from within that native community to bring the story to the forefront. Again, helping people that maybe are not familiar with that community, just a look into their lives, a look into their stories, and also building that empathy for, native people and indigenous people. And then lastly, a game that I also played recently, Tell Me Why, I think was a really great one for their portrayal of, many complex characters, but also a complex transgender character as well. And then a more nuanced look at childhood trauma that I feel like a lot of people could relate to, or at least feel empathy towards.
All a bunch of games that I need to try and play, especially Animal Crossing, though I feel like that might be an addiction if I play that game, so I might have to stay away from it.
It's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope with Animal Crossing.
Dr. Kat, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I was just agreeing. That was a list of games that I wholeheartedly agree are amazing.
Awesome. I'll just drop one, although there's not a lot to it per se on the surface. I think I'm always going to bring up Sims as being one of those games for change. At least for me, when I started playing it way back when, Sims 2 specifically is where I started. I didn't have Black characters that I could play with. So that was my opportunity to create my own imagined world. And now with all of this, I still play to this day, although they take all of my money. Being able to download content, custom content that Black creators create themselves, so that you can further see yourself in a game like that, is something that speaks to me completely, something that I always push people to try to play, even though they don't like Sims as much as I do. But it's a great game. So with that being said, I would love to know, given all of the things that you brought up, each and every one of you, are there components in a game that makes you think of it as an effective tool for education or edutainment, or however we want to put it, that can help people learn about society? So what components are there that just, the secret ingredients that make a game perfect for social change?
I think I'm a little bit biased as a narrative and realization producer, but I truly believe that the characters that we allow our players to be or interact with, and the relationships they form, the conversations that they can have, as well as the stories we tell through them, is an extremely effective tool for learning about society, especially if you are playing as someone that you don't particularly associate with, right? Just like we talked about before, the fact that you're able to step into somebody else's shoes, or maybe even interact with an NPC that maybe you haven't had the chance to interact with somebody like that in your life. And so when we build these worlds and create these stories that give players a different view than the one that they're used to, I think that we're taking a step in the right direction for social good, because we're being able to sort of bring them into that perspective or bring them into that conversation a little bit easier.
I absolutely love that. And I was going to say something along the same lines, like having those relatable characters, those ones that, you know, when you're playing, you're like, this person could be me, or this is the person I want to be, is great. And this is where I'll use a lot of like the tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, you know, where you can create your own character, giving them the characteristics, you know, that either you display or you want to display. And that's where I will, again, as a therapist, come in and say, okay, so why does this character have this characteristic? Why did you give them this? And then they can explore, you know, difficult concepts through the game and be able to try it out in a gaming format before trying to adapt it to real life. And that's something that we, as what we call geek therapists, that's our big thing, is the relatable characters.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that having characters where you could take on new perspectives and learn about yourself and learn about others absolutely can be very educational. I will actually go out and say that I think almost any game could be educational. It's really like how you use the game and how you match it to the audience. I'm the editor for a book called 100 Games to Use in the Classroom and Beyond. It's free to download. You can check it out. And we have like all different kinds of games in there, like Call of Duty, not a game you would think of. I mean, we have Minecraft and we have Fortnite. I mean, we have like really popular games, some games that are made explicitly for education, and obviously some that are made for all different purposes. But I think with like a really good educator, teacher, mentor could use a game in all different ways to match with someone's interest, to help elicit the kinds of things that they want, like whether it's getting in touch with who they are, being mindful, taking on new perspectives, learning about a person that isn't them, understanding the Black experience. Like all of these things could be elicited with different kinds of games. You know, the same game, on the other hand, could work really well with one audience and another audience totally fall flat. So, and I mean, even like myself, like I have games that I play in my classroom, like games you wouldn't think of, like Among Us, which is a game where you're trying to figure out who the imposter is, and like you're kind of like you're sus, you're suspicious, you know, all these things that you wouldn't think of as like educational. And one class I might play it and people are like understanding the ethical ramifications, and we're having a really rich discussion around the ethics of playing this game. And then in another class, you know, there might be a totally different dynamic, same age group, same exact class, you know, I teach college students, just, you know, one's on a Monday, one's on a Wednesday, and it's just like a different dynamic happens and it just doesn't work. And that's sort of like the messiness of games, which I think is also beautiful, is that it's dynamic and it's not just the game, but it's how the player interacts with it and how the mentor educator uses it, and all of that special sauce mixed together, and you just never know what's going to happen, right? You just don't know. And beautiful. It's also a little scary, but I think that's what I love about games. It's like improv in a way.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so sorry. I think that's just so true, and it really speaks to my experience, but also the experience I just have with my friends, right? Like we could play the same game from start to finish and have two wildly different experiences, but then also with the same level of depth, right? Like we're talking about things that we really liked, and maybe I hated one part that they absolutely loved, or, you know, vice versa. And I think that's what's so powerful about it, is that there is this messiness, games are dynamic, but that's also mirroring life a little bit, right? Like we're never going to wake up and feel the same as we do one day and exactly the same way we do the next day. But I think the learnings that we can take from that, the fact that there is a little bit of this push and pull and this chaos that sort of comes back to where, you know, we write ourselves back up over again, is true for both our lives, but also for games. And I think it's really cool that we can see that play out in both.
I think that's what's so great about games in that way, is that they really express the messiness of life in that way that I think other media can't quite capture is that, like, you never know what's going to happen. It's unpredictable in some ways, and life is unpredictable, and that's kind of cool, a little scary, but also really beautiful.
I'll quickly just jump in and say things that I think are just two things that I think are like secret sauce to social change or even personal change, to be honest, is obviously narrative that makes you think a little differently. But I would also say the difficulty of the game itself could be a part of social change. Because I think about Final Fantasy VII Remake and playing it on hard mode. I have yet to finish, but it's difficult, and it's making me have to think differently and change the way I approach video games. And then in a way, when you put yourself through those situations, it will ultimately make you sort of change the way you adapt to different things as well. So I also think that's super important in social change, or of course, personal change as well. So with that being said, I would love to know why you think there's such a boom of edutainment, education, or entertainment, however you want to go with that, regarding mental health, activism, and identity-based games. Obviously, we have a diverse population of people, voices are now being heard, but why do you think companies are starting to step up, and why do you think people are starting to reach out and ask for more representation in these games from different perspectives?
Again, there's that stigma, right, regarding mental health, like even still to this day. So being able to be represented in a video game, it helps kind of take that stigma out of it. Like even our favorite characters, no matter how powerful they are, no matter, what kind of skills they know, they're still, subjected to the same things that we are. And I think that it's important, especially kids nowadays are spending more time, on the virtual type of formats, playing video games. Like, you hear that they're not spending as much time outside, whatever the case may be, but they're still socializing through online gaming and things like that. So being able to have, again, develop that empathy and understand, like, people do experience things like depression and anxiety and trauma, and to be able to see that in a video game, it can help develop those empathy skills and be able to recognize it in themselves if it's happening, and be able, again, to have that character that they really relate to, that, again, like could be the most powerful character on the planet, but they're still dealing with the same things we are. And I bring The Witcher back into it, not necessarily a lot of mental health themes, but he's a very powerful, strong character, and all the townspeople, even though no matter how much he helps them, they still look at him like, you're a mutant, like it's, and he's ostracized. And, to be able to see, like, somebody like that could still be kind of ostracized and bullied, like it makes people feel less alone.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I also think a lot of what we're seeing and the boom towards it is because a lot of people have come to see how interesting and powerful games as a medium can be. I think we've talked a lot about in this evening about just how the power of play, right? And how we learn through play. And I think we're really starting to come around to that. I think the era in which it was like seen as just something to have fun with, just something for, the boys to do, I think we're really coming out of that. And so we do see people of all ages and all walks of life being drawn to it. And it's quite simply because games are fun. And people like to have fun, people like to play, and they also like to be entertained. So I think on the one hand, it's often the more palatable version of doing something. If you're going to educate people and you also know that people like to play, why not make sure that they have fun while doing it? But I think it also combines something that the majority of people want, which is the act of being able to explore and to create and to be a part of something, just like Nicole said, to not be alone. And I think that's why we're seeing this boom, especially being more, I guess, connected on the internet versus, connected one-to-one, or I guess physically, not just because of the recent pandemic, but also because that's just where we're heading towards the more technological age. So the fact that we're already being a part of this evolution, I think it's just a natural evolution as well to see this boom in edutainment.
I was just going to say that I think people are starting to realize, and maybe they've been realizing this for a while, but we're finally all, like, the public starting to accept it, that games are communities. They are places where we live, right? And we engage with public life through games, like whether it's Overwatch or Fortnite or Valorant. I mean, League of Legends, like people are having the life conversations, right? That's where life is happening, and that's okay. That's okay, right? We're starting to see that, especially with the pandemic, people were like, all right, you can, we're encouraging this now. Like, we know that you've always been doing this, but now we're accepting it and encouraging it. And I could see that even like in my small sphere, like 10 years ago, when I would tell fellow parents that I was working on games, they would look at me like I was the devil and I was going to like poison their children. And, like, oh my gosh, how could you be working on that? It was like I was like making cigarettes or something. And now, or at least more recently, when I've been telling people that that's what I do, I think other parents were like, oh, that's interesting. Like, tell me more. Like, they seem more curious about it. And so I'm hoping that that trajectory keeps expanding, because there's so many different kinds of ways to play. And I think a lot of people have these, unfortunately, preconceived notions and myths and moral panics around games because it's new and scary and their kids are doing it and they don't really understand it. But I think we're starting to get to a point where the parents maybe grew up with games, or they're starting to play games with their kids, maybe during the pandemic, and they're starting to open up and see like, oh, I get it now. It's like, I'm a gamer, so of course I play games with my kids every day. But I think parents are starting to realize, open their hearts to play, and they're remembering the wonder and just, like you said, the fun of playing and allowing themselves to play again and be that kid again, because we all should be allowed to play.
And we hear a lot about, the mental health crisis, right? Like that's a big thing, especially as of lately. And, access to mental health care, it's becoming increasingly difficult. Practitioners are full, and it's getting harder and harder to be able to get in to see, somebody in the mental health field. The thing is that games can be therapeutic. Not saying that they're a replacement for therapy, but they very much can be. And again, for somebody that might be feeling isolated, might be feeling alone, having that sense of community through the online gaming can make all the difference. And also, again, being able to explore in the game, like, being faced with different tasks where you have to use those problem solving skills and be like, how would I deal with this if this was real life? Or, maybe I'll take a gamble and see how this works, and, maybe see if I can adapt it to my regular life. It can be really therapeutic and very, very beneficial. Not a replacement for therapy, but at least maybe something to get somebody through. And there's much more access to video games at this point in time.
I gotta say, just really quickly, Stardew Valley is my therapy.
Big one.
Oh my gosh, just farming. And it also brought me closer to like, oh, I should probably get into gardening like my grandma, and all kinds of emotions, all kinds of crazy stuff, but very therapeutic for me. So now we're going to trend towards really quickly the negative side, but how we can also fix the negative side of this. So since you all are connected to games in some way, shape, or form, you already know that there are people who push back on the idea of games needing to be educational. And of course, we can make the argument they don't have to be. You play them for what you need them for. Understood. But there are still people who are pushing back on diversity and activism and identity-based things. And so why do you think there's such pushback from that? However you want to answer that, because that's such a big, gigantic question with many different answers that can be applied to it.
I'd say that a lot of people might be afraid of change, and there's a lot of these topics in the news as of late: diversity, inclusion, LGBTQIA type topics. And, we see them on the news, we see them on social media. And I think a lot of people use games as a means of escape. And, when they're all on social media and they're seeing it on the news, and then they go to play a game and, it's there as well, it might be something that they're just like, I'm using this as a means to get away from all of this, and now I'm still in it. Use the game for what it's, just for entertainment purposes, if that's what floats your boat.
I absolutely agree. I think for many people, change is scary and it's uncomfortable. And quite often what comes out as pushback against social good is at its core a pushback against change, or the feeling that once was, that previous landscape for gaming is now different. And I think the fear is that it won't be as good or it won't be the same. But the truth is that previous landscape was only good for a very select group of people. Mm-hmm. And so how we combat this problem, I think there's many ways that we can combat it. But what first comes to mind, I think, are two things. So one, through education. We can encourage that people educate themselves, or, some people are also already in the space of educating others on the benefits of gaming for social good, and just to further those conversations and bring people to the table. And, two, I think for those of us who are already in that space, there is also a responsibility for us to advocate within our own industries and within our own communities. That's one of the ways we can combat this negativity, is for pushing for the proactive social change at the heart of development, at least for myself personally within game development, but also within our communities and for the next generation. I'm hoping that we can get to a place where, for the next generation, the people coming up, this is their normal, right? Gaming for social good, or gaming for what it is their normal. And so we're not having as much of that negative pushback the longer we go.
Look, games are reflective of humanity, and humanity has a wide spectrum going from compassion to cruelty. And you're going to see that in the gaming space too, right? So I think there was some statistic from an ADL study of online gamers that said that over 80% had experienced some kind of harassment or hate in an online game. Really high number, right? Over 80%. But then on the other side, it was like over 90% had experienced some kind of really special kind of connection, like a friendship or mentor, got help in some way, supported someone else in a game, in an online game. So you see there's again, games are communities, so you're going to see that spectrum of behavior. And so what do we do? How do we push more toward the compassion side and less toward the cruelty side? And the way I'm doing it is I created something called the Inclusive Games Network. And we are just a group of people interested in making games more accessible, more caring, more compassionate, open to more people. And so every month we have a speaker. It's all open and free. There's a Discord community where we connect. We talk about different things like exemplars of accessible games, exemplars of positive representations, inclusive communities. And, we do all kinds of advocacy for that. And we just started, but there's other awesome, WIGI is another example, right, of an organization that does a really great job of connecting women and non-binary people and femme-identifying people to really feel like they have a sense of community within the games community. And I think that's beautiful, like finding your people, finding that collective voice to make change is really powerful.
Yeah, I was going to say that I completely agree. And I especially like what you said about it being, it's different, right? It could be different for really everyone, and also can be different for every game. And so specifically being in game development, the last thing we want is for any of this social good or this impact representation or other facets of these educational systems to be performative. And so one of the attributes that makes gaming such a powerful driver for social change is the fact that it's loved by millions, right? Especially these larger AAA games or like these more popular games. And so when we're in this entertainment space and we also want to have a social impact, we really have to ask ourselves what's authentic to the game, and like what's authentic to the brand and also to the world that they've already created, and how within that can they take the steps to provide their players with the opportunities to problem solve or to participate in learning within a space that truly speaks to the game's core. And there's also a chance potentially in doing that exercise that they find it's hard to actually answer that, right? Like, well, maybe there's nothing that we can do that drives that social impact. But at that point, at least they've reached the first step into trying to figure out why that is, really why they've built a game that can't be malleable to that. And then what they can then do moving forward to get to a place where we can actually have that.
Awesome. So we are almost out of time. So I want to wrap it up with one more question. And I would love if you could just give some advice to viewers or whoever may be watching this later on what advice would you give them to make a societal impact with games domestically and globally? And I know it's a huge question. So to give an example, before I got into games or what I'm doing for full time, I used to actually be a career coach. So I used to tell people all the time, if you want to make an impact, then join the industry. So for you, what would you tell other people to do if they want to make a social impact with games? Tough question. I know. There's no wrong answer.
I think I always sort of default to, at a baseline, just educating yourself. Just start by educating yourself on the various forms of education, entertainment-based games that are already out there, just to get a sense of them. And then also, if you're just like hungry to get out there and make a difference, I also want to say that it's okay to start small, right? Like you can start within your community, you can start within your friend group, right? Like maybe you want to do some volunteer work, similar to what I do with Black Kids Code, or maybe there's just social good initiatives specific to gaming that you can be a part of. Like Extra Life is a good one, donates money to children's hospitals in North America through just playing games, right? And I think the last thing I would say is that we're all stronger together. So finding a group, really just finding a community again of like-minded people, or maybe different minds, as long as you're pushing towards the same goal and you're able to connect with them on that, I think is a powerful first few steps to drive that societal impact in games all together.
My type of therapy that I do, it's all about helping my clients find their inner hero. And a lot of the games that we play, it's that hero, saving the day type of narrative. And so, playing that game and then adapting it to real life, like, what would your character do in this situation? How can you be more like this character in real life? What would they do in order to, better their community, or help a friend, even something as small as just like helping a friend that's experiencing similar issues or things of that nature, and being able to kind of embody the character a little bit, kind of take on those traits that really resonate with a person to go out and to do good in society, in their communities. My advice to them would be, just be the best version of you, and take the aspects of the character that really resonate with you, and help develop your identity a little bit more, and be your own hero.
Amazing. I would love to be my own hero. Yeah, I would definitely tell people to play and play and play and play and try and fail, and be okay with failure. And really to embody the things that games are good at, which is like curiosity and experimenting and taking on new perspectives, taking on a different way of thinking about the world, and embodying that, right? Because that ethos is going to help to change the world. We need that. We need those new perspectives, more people included in that. We need to experiment and be creative and be curious and be solving these really big problems that we're facing. And we need game players, and we need you. So join us.
Completely agree. And that, especially if you are interested in making games, we need your voices, right? The only way that we tell different stories is if we have different people telling those stories, and people who have the genuine experience to tell them. And then once you see that reflected, people, the next generation will say like, you know what? Yeah, that speaks to me. And then it just keeps being this cyclical cycle for good. So we also need you in the game development space.
Awesome. And with that, I want to thank Vanessa, Kat, and Nicole for joining. To all of you out there, I hope you learned something here today about how social good and gaming can influence and educate us all. This episode was made possible by support from our friends at Maximum Games. And come join Open World Dialogue right here on Twitch every second Wednesday of the month. This is Robin Mosley signing off. Bye.